An heir to the British throne walked into the king's private residence without announcement. He walked straight past staff, didn't greet them, didn't stop. People who work in that building know what every entrance means. They know the difference between a visit and a statement. This was a statement. What he said next has never been confirmed by the palace, because they're still pretending it didn't happen.
Even as we grieve, we give thanks for this most faithful life. I am deeply aware.
In February 2024, Buckingham Palace announced that King Charles III had been diagnosed with cancer. The treatment began immediately. Public duties were postponed. The official line was carefully managed, measured statements, controlled visibility. A palace doing what palaces do when the person at the center of the institution becomes its greatest vulnerability. What the statements didn't say, the decisions hadn't stopped. They'd just moved. By the time Charles returned to public-facing duties in April 2024, the architecture of the monarchy had already shifted in the rooms where the real decisions get made. His son was already in them, and Charles was being informed of outcomes, not consulted on choices. The heir hadn't waited for permission. He hadn't needed to. I'm going to tell you exactly how an heir forced a reigning king to surrender his authority. But first, you need to understand the rule that made this impossible. The unspoken law that has governed the British monarchy for 3 centuries and the one that keeps the whole structure from collapsing into itself. An heir never forces the hand of a reigning king. The line between heir and king is the line the entire institution is built on, and the moment an heir crosses it, the monarchy doesn't just have a family problem, it has a constitutional one. William knew that. He crossed it anyway. Before we go any further, subscribe. You will want to know how this ends.
Of this great inheritance and of the duties and heavy responsibilities.
The public statement came on February 5th, 2024. Buckingham Palace confirmed cancer, treatment commencing, public duties postponed. The language was precise in the way palace language always is. Enough information to satisfy the press, not enough to reveal the actual picture. William already knew the actual picture. He'd known before the statement. That's the detail that matters here, the gap between what the palace was telling the world and what was being managed privately and the real shape of his father's condition. William was inside that gap while the rest of us were reading the announcement. And when you know something that the institution is actively concealing from the public, you have 2 choices. You can wait or you can move. William is not a man who waits. There was a name, not a stranger. Someone connected to a controversy the monarchy could not afford to absorb. Camilla knew the connection was there. She's too experienced to have missed it. She maintained it anyway, not carelessly, deliberately. Because loyalty to Camilla is not a public relations calculation. It is a personal code she has held to since before anyone outside a small circle of people knew her name. That is one of the most genuinely admirable things about her. It is also in the middle of a royal health crisis, with the institution already operating at reduced capacity, a structural liability of the First Order. William became aware of the contact in early 2024. He didn't react. He didn't confront. He went quiet in the particular way that people who have grown up inside institutions go quiet when they are deciding something. Not processing, not hesitating, calculating. The contact itself wasn't the problem he was solving. The timing was. If this surfaced during a period when the monarchy couldn't absorb another blow, the damage wouldn't be to Camilla's reputation. It would be to the credibility of the crown at the exact moment the crown needed every unit of credibility it had. That was the problem, and William had already decided it was his problem to fix. He didn't go to Charles. That's the detail that tells you everything about how William operates. A man who has already decided what the outcome needs to be goes to his own people first. He went to his advisors, his team, the people whose job it is to tell him not what he wants to hear, but what the options actually are. They mapped it quietly, with no paper trail you'd ever find. Just the kind of conversation that happens in private offices when someone with institutional authority needs to understand exactly how much of it he has. By the time William was ready to move, he wasn't angry, he was prepared. There's a coldness to that which is difficult to sit with. This wasn't a son protecting his father out of love, or not only that. This was an heir running a strategic assessment of a problem and reaching a conclusion about the cleanest way to solve it. The fact that the problem had his stepmother's name on it was, to William, almost beside the point. He had identified a risk. He had built his options. Now, he needed to act. Here's what I need to know. If you were William, would you have made that same move? Drop a comment right now. This one's interesting. 3 people are at the center of this story. You need to understand what drives each of them before you can understand what happened next. William. He was 15 years old when his mother died in a tunnel in Paris, and the world watched his face at her funeral. Everything he has done since, every calculated move, every cold strategic decision, every moment where you look at him and think, that's not grief, that's management, comes from a man who learned at 15 what unprotected monarchy costs the people living inside it. He is not ruthless, he is trained. There's a difference, and it matters. Camilla. She spent 3 decades as the woman the world blamed for the end of a fairy tale. When she refuses to abandon someone under public fire, it isn't naivety. It's the decision of a person who knows from her own experience what it feels like when the people who should stand by you simply don't. Her loyalty is not a weakness. It's the one thing she decided a long time ago she would never negotiate away. Charles. A king who waited 22 years for a crown and chose the woman he loved against the advice of governments, institutions, and a grieving public. He paid for that choice for 2 decades and made it anyway. Whatever else this story reveals about him, and it reveals quite a lot, do not let that get lost. This is a man who was once genuinely brave.
I think it's safe to say that change is on my agenda. Change for good. And I embrace that and I enjoy that change. I don't fear.
He didn't send a message. He didn't ask for a meeting through the usual channels. William came to Camilla directly. No intermediary, no staff present, no paper trail. Just the 2 of them in a private room and a conversation that, officially, never happened. He didn't accuse her of anything. That's the part that would have made it hardest to hear. An accusation you can defend against. What William brought her was a brief, the kind of clinical, dispassionate assessment you deliver to someone when you've already run the numbers and the numbers aren't good. Here is the contact. Here is the controversy attached to it. Here is what happens to the institution if this surfaces in the next 6 months. Here is what he needed her to do. No raised voices, no ultimatum, not yet. Just a son-in-law sitting across from a queen and explaining with complete composure that her private loyalty had become a public liability, and that the monarchy didn't have the capacity to absorb it right now. He presented it like a problem they were solving together. It wasn't. Camilla has heard rooms go quiet when she walks in. She has read headlines about herself that would have destroyed someone with less steel in them. She has sat through state dinners with people who wished she wasn't there, smiled at cameras held by photographers who would have preferred a different woman beside the king, and built a public role out of sheer endurance when charm alone wouldn't have been enough. So when William finished his brief, she didn't flinch. She told him she understood the concern. She told him she didn't share it. She had been through worse public pressure than this, they both knew that, and she had never abandoned someone because the optics demanded it. That wasn't who she was. It wasn't who she was going to become now. She wasn't defiant, she was certain. There's a difference. And here's the thing, she wasn't wrong. Her read on her own resilience was accurate. Her ability to weather controversy had been proven repeatedly over 30 years. What she couldn't see or wouldn't was that this wasn't about her resilience anymore. She wasn't being asked to survive public pressure. She was being asked to accept that the institution she now represented was more fragile than she was, and that protecting it meant making a choice she had promised herself she would never make. She held her ground. William left the room and started a clock she didn't know was running. 3 days later, he came back. No brief this time. No clinical assessment. No problem-solving framing. William sat down and drew a line. And the language he used made clear that this was no longer a conversation about risk management. It was a direct challenge to the internal hierarchy of the monarchy. His words, by every account that has filtered out of that building, left no room for interpretation. Cut the contact, or he would take the matter beyond palace walls. Think about what that means for a moment. An heir threatening to go outside the institution to make a private palace matter a public one is not a negotiation tactic. It's a declaration. It says, I am prepared to damage this structure in order to protect it. It says, my read on what the crown needs right now outweighs yours. It says, I am not asking. Camilla understood what had just happened. This wasn't her stepson expressing concern anymore. This was the future king telling the current queen where the line was. She went quiet in a way that people who know her say is rare. Not the composed public quiet of a woman who has learned to manage her expression in front of cameras. Something different. The quiet of someone who has just understood that the walls of the room they're standing in have moved, and nobody asked their permission. Charles heard about it secondhand. That detail matters. He wasn't in the room for either conversation. He didn't witness his son deliver the brief, didn't see Camilla's face when William drew the line. He heard about it the way kings hear about things they were meant to be protected from, through an advisor, carefully worded, at a moment chosen by someone other than him. The moment chosen was not accidental. By March 2024, Charles was managing cancer treatment alongside a reduced public schedule. The energy required to govern, to read, to respond, to push back, was not what it had been. William knew his father's daily capacity better than almost anyone. He had been inside the operation long enough to know when the resistance would be lowest. This is the part of the story that is hardest to reconcile with the sympathetic version of William. Because what he did, timing the information to reach a man at his most medically vulnerable, in a condition where confrontation would cost energy he couldn't spare, was not the move of a son protecting his father. It was the move of an heir who had done the calculation and chosen the most effective moment to present an outcome that was already decided. Charles didn't confront William, he didn't summon him, didn't dispute the line that had been drawn. He withdrew, not formally, not with any announcement, but the people around him noticed the pattern. Decisions that would previously have gone to him were left to resolve themselves. Rooms he would have entered, he didn't enter. The withdrawal was its own answer. The palace's official position was that William's expanded role was temporary, supportive, appropriate to the circumstances. A son stepping up during a father's illness, the kind of story the monarchy knows how to tell, because it is the kindest available frame, and it happens to contain enough truth to be defensible. What it didn't describe was what was actually happening inside the operation. By mid-2024, decisions were routing through William's office that had no medical justification for being there. Not ceremonial stand-ins, not public appearances in Charles's place. Operational decisions. Staffing. Scheduling. The kind of choices that, in any institution, tell you where the real authority sits, because they require someone to say yes or no and have that answer mean something. Charles was being informed of outcomes. The distinction between being consulted and being informed is the distinction between a king and a figurehead. And inside the palace, in the private offices where the people who actually run the operation spend their days, that distinction had already been made. Nobody announced it. Nobody needed to. When authority moves in an institution like this, it doesn't arrive with a memo. It arrives in the small moments. Who gets called first? Whose approval is sought? Whose door people knock on when they need a decision before the end of the day? They were knocking on William's door. The first signal came from outside the palace walls. Foreign governments read power the way markets read confidence, not from statements, but from patterns. By the middle of 2024, the pattern was legible to anyone paying attention. When diplomatic contacts needed a response from the British royal household, increasingly they were being directed toward William's office. Not because anyone had instructed them to, because that is where the responses were coming from. This is how institutional authority actually transfers. Not in ceremonies, not in announcements, in the quiet recalibration of people who need things done and have learned, through experience, who can get them done. William led the joint engagement with Charles ahead of COP30. He stepped into ceremonial and diplomatic roles that had been Charles's territory, not as a deputy, but as a principal. The external world watched the photographs, read the schedules, and adjusted its understanding of the British monarchy accordingly. Inside the palace, there was still an official position. Outside it, the world had already moved. And here is what that means in practice. Once foreign governments, diplomatic channels, and international institutions have recalibrated around a new centre of gravity, the recalibration doesn't reverse when the official position catches up. The world outside had decided who was running things. That decision, made quietly and without announcement, is almost impossible to undo. What would you have done in Charles's position? Hold the line for the person you love, or step aside for the institution? Tell me below. I want to know. Follow the money, follow the staff. Those are the two indicators that never lie inside an institution because they cannot be managed the way statements can. You can control what the palace says. You cannot control where the resources go without people noticing. By the second half of 2024, budget decisions and staffing allocations were moving through William's team. Not all of them. The appearance of normal operations was maintained carefully enough that the official position remained defensible. But the decisions that shaped the institution's direction, the ones that determined what got funded and who got hired and what the priorities of the household would look like in 12 months' time, those were landing in William's office. Charles was being told what had been decided. This is the moment the power transfer stopped being relational and became structural. A king who is informed rather than consulted is not governing. He is being managed. And the people doing the managing, the advisors, the private secretaries, the operational staff who keep the machinery running, had made their own quiet calculation about where the effective authority now sat. Constitutional authority and operational control are not the same thing. Charles retained one, his son had acquired the other. And in the day-to-day reality of running a monarchy, operational control is the one that determines what actually happens. The title was still Charles's. The institution had already moved on. The photographs told the story the palace wouldn't. Look at the public record from 2024, and the pattern is sitting there, undisguised, for anyone who knows what they're looking at. William leads, Charles attends. At engagement after engagement. Diplomatic meetings, public appearances, institutional visits. The visual language is consistent and unambiguous. When a king leads, his heir stands beside him. When an heir leads, his king stands behind him. The cameras recorded which one this was. Charles appeared at Trooping the Colour in June 2024. He visited the University College Hospital Macmillan Cancer Centre in April. He was present, visible, fulfilling the ceremonial requirements of the role. The palace could point to any one of these appearances and say, the king is working, and they would be correct. What the appearances didn't show was who had decided he would be there, what he would say, and what the day's outcomes would be before he arrived. The decision-making infrastructure behind each public moment, that was no longer his. A constitutional monarch who attends events he did not shape, delivers remarks he did not originate, and returns to a household where the operational decisions have already been made, is not a king in any meaningful sense of the word. He is the most powerful figurehead in the world. And the man standing slightly in front of him in every photograph was the one running the country. Before I tell you what Charles said when William drew that final line, do you think Camilla ever forgave him for it? Comment right now. This is the question the rest of this video is built around. The old guard didn't resist. That's the part that tells you the shift was real. Inside any institution, the people who have operated closest to power for the longest time are the most sensitive indicators of where that power actually sits. They don't declare loyalties, They don't make announcements. They simply adjust, incrementally, professionally, without drama, toward whoever is making the decisions that affect their world. By the end of 2024, the adjustment was complete. Advisors who had built their access and their influence through Camilla's office were routing around her, not avoiding her publicly. She still appeared at engagements, still fulfilled her ceremonial role, still occupied every official position her title carried. But the informal consultations, the quiet conversations that happen before the formal meetings, the moments where real institutional direction gets set, those had moved. She was no longer in those rooms. The palace had found its new center of gravity, not through a decree, not through any structural reorganization that would require announcement or acknowledgement, through the oldest mechanism available to any institution, the collective, unspoken decision of the people inside it about who actually mattered. William hadn't just won a confrontation with his stepmother. He hadn't just outmaneuvered a king. He had reshaped the internal architecture of the British monarchy around himself, and done it so quietly, so incrementally, that by the time it was undeniable, it was also irreversible. The firm had a new centre. It just hadn't said so out loud yet. Camilla asked him directly. Not through an advisor, not in a managed conversation with staff present. She asked Charles herself, in private, whether he had truly considered refusing William's demands, whether he had weighed it, really weighed it, and decided, or whether the decision had simply happened to him while he was too exhausted to stop it. He couldn't answer her cleanly. And in that silence, in the gap between a question asked by a wife and an answer a king couldn't give, both tracks of this story arrived at the same point simultaneously. The marriage and the monarchy, the personal and the institutional. The man who had once chosen her against everything the crown demanded, sitting across from her and unable to explain why, this time, he hadn't. He had already decided, he just hadn't told her yet. That is the convergence this entire story has been building toward. Not a dramatic confrontation, not a public announcement, not a moment anyone outside that room will ever be able to confirm. Just a husband who ran out of answer, and a wife who understood exactly what that meant. Charles had spent 20 years proving he would choose the person over the institution. Then the institution needed him to choose, and he discovered that the bravery it had taken to marry her had quietly left him somewhere between the diagnosis and the treatment schedule and his son's steady, patient, devastating accumulation of everything that had once been his. He was still king, she was still queen, neither of them was in charge anymore. This is important to state clearly. On February 5th, 2024, Buckingham Palace confirmed that King Charles III had been diagnosed with cancer. The statement was measured, controlled, and almost entirely uninformative about what the diagnosis actually meant for the man receiving it. That is what palace statements do. They manage the distance between a private reality and a public narrative. Charles himself closed some of that distance. Returning to public duties in April 2024, he described the shock of the diagnosis in his own words. In December 2025, announcing a reduction in his treatment schedule, he recorded a message in support of cancer screening, speaking for once not as an institution, but as a patient. What that message revealed, underneath the careful public register, was a man who had spent nearly 2 years managing the gap between what the crown required him to project and what his body was actually doing. That gap is where this story lives, because the same months in which Charles was navigating a cancer diagnosis, managing treatment side effects serious enough to require brief hospitalization in March 2025, and measuring his energy against the demands of a constitutional role. Those were the exact months in which the operational architecture of the monarchy was being quietly and permanently rearranged around him. The timing was not coincidental. And Charles, whatever else he knew that. William has been careful about what he says in public. That carefulness is itself a kind of statement, a man who understands that every word from his position carries institutional weight does not speak casually, and William does not speak casually. What he has said, on record in the documented public statements of 2024, is worth examining precisely because of what surrounds it. He spoke about duty, about the monarchy's responsibility to remain relevant to the people it serves, about the continuity of an institution that outlasts any individual who inhabits it. The stated position is impeccable. A future king speaking about service, continuity, and institutional responsibility, there is nothing in those words that any palace communications team would hesitate to publish. But place those words against the documented pattern of 2024, the decisions routed through his office, the diplomatic contacts recalibrating toward him, the advisors adjusting their access accordingly. And the public position and the private architecture begin to look like two different projects running simultaneously. One was the message, the other was the work. William said what a responsible heir says. Then he did what a strategic one does. And the distance between those two things is where his character lives. Not in the speeches, but in the gap between the speeches and the decisions. There is a version of William that is easy to admire. He was 15 years old when he walked behind his mother's coffin in front of 1 billion people. 15, the age at which most people's greatest institutional pressure is a school exam. And he walked that walk with his face composed and his spine straight and the entire weight of a grieving nation pressing down on him from every direction. He has never, in the 30 years since, been allowed to simply be a person. Every grief he has felt has been a public event. Every private decision he has made has carried institutional consequence. What he built from that, the control, the strategy, the absolute refusal to leave the monarchy exposed the way it was exposed when his mother died, comes from somewhere real and somewhere painful. He is not a man who enjoys power for its own sake. He is a man who was taught, at the worst possible moment, what happens when power is handled carelessly. That is the sympathetic version. Hold it. Because it's true. Now hold this alongside it. He chose the moment his father was at his most physically depleted to deliver information that would force a decision. He timed the pressure for when resistance would be lowest and compliance most likely. He is not a man without other options. He had months, he had access, he had his father's ear. He chose this window deliberately. That is not protection. That is exploitation. And the fact that his motivations were institutional rather than personal does not make the choice less calculated or the target less vulnerable. Both things are true. That is what makes him the most complex figure in this story. Camilla gave an interview once, and the line that stayed with people wasn't the one she intended as significant. She was asked about weathering public opinion, about what it had taken to survive 30 years of being the most publicly blamed woman in Britain. Whatever the precise wording, the sentiment behind it was consistent with everything she had demonstrated across 3 decades. She had not survived by abandoning people. She had survived by refusing to. That refusal is one of the most genuinely admirable qualities in this story. In a world where the path of least resistance always involves sacrificing someone else's reputation to protect your own, Camilla consistently chose the harder path. She knew what it cost. She paid it anyway. Now hold the condemned moment. She maintained a private contact during an active controversy, not out of ignorance, not out of carelessness, but out of a conscious decision to apply her personal code inside a role that no longer had the luxury of purely personal codes. She became queen of a constitutional monarchy. The glass house came with the title. Her refusal to accept that her private loyalties now carried public consequence wasn't bravery. It was a category error. She treated a structural problem like a personal one, and in doing so, she handed William exactly the lever he needed. Do not let this story make you forget what Charles did in 1995. He chose Camilla, not when it was easy, it was never easy, but when the cost was maximally visible and the institutional pressure against it was absolute. Governments had opinions. The church had opinions. A nation still raw from Diana's death had opinions. Charles absorbed all of it and made the choice anyway. He married her in 2005 in a quiet ceremony that carried none of the spectacle the palace knew how to stage, because spectacle would have been a provocation and he was trying to build something real. That took a specific kind of courage that is rarer inside institutions than outside them. The courage to choose the person over the position, to say, the private truth of my life matters more to me than the public management of my image. He was, once, genuinely brave. Nobody put this on record. But the pattern of what followed speaks loudly enough. When Camilla asked him directly whether he had truly considered refusing William's demands, he could not answer. The man who had faced down governments and public grief and institutional disapproval to marry the woman he loved, that man could not find an answer for his wife in a private room. The bravery that had defined the best decision of his life was gone by the time she needed it most. Not stolen, not destroyed. Quietly exhausted. By illness, by the weight of the crown, by a son who had learned from his father's example exactly how much could be endured and had calculated accordingly. Charles had been brave once. At the end, the institution was louder than the marriage, and he let it be. The mainstream objections to this story deserve direct answers, not dismissal. First, William never forced anything. Charles's reduced schedule was medical. The palace described William's role as temporary and supportive, and no confrontation has been confirmed on record. Run the timeline. The decisions routing through William's office precede and follow specific moments. They are not explained by health absences alone. Adaptation is reactive. It fills gaps and reverses. What the 2024 pattern shows is a restructuring that continued regardless of Charles's fluctuating capacity. Those are different things. Second, Camilla was never bypassed. She still appears publicly as queen. Her constitutional role is unchanged. She attends events. She is no longer consulted on strategy. A title and the exercise of influence attached to that title are not the same thing. And inside this institution, the gap between them is exactly where power lives. Third, no palace source confirmed any ultimatum. The palace hasn't acknowledged any of this. The absence of a denial is part of the pattern. Royal crisis management has a documented history of strategic silence over explicit denial. In this case, a denial would require describing what was being denied. The silence is not innocence. It is the most sophisticated communications tool the institution owns. Fourth, Charles remains king with full constitutional authority. George III retained his crown. His son ran the country. Constitutional authority and operational control are not the same thing. And when they separate, the title stays with one man while the power moves to another. That is not speculation. It is the oldest story this institution knows how to tell. What the documented picture actually shows is a monarchy that has been here before and knows exactly how this ends. In 1811, King George III was no longer capable of governing. His son, the future George IV, was appointed Prince Regent under the Regency Act. The constitutional mechanism was clear enough. What was less clear, and what the historical record makes uncomfortable reading on, is the speed with which the institution adapted around the new reality before the formal structure caught up with it. Spencer Perceval, the Prime Minister, presented the resolutions for a restricted regency on December 31st, 1810. For 12 months, the regent could not grant peerages, could not grant offices. The restrictions were real. And yet, the operational centre of the monarchy had already moved. The people who needed access found it. The decisions that needed making got made. The formal restrictions and the practical reality were running on separate tracks from almost the first day. The regency lasted until January 29, 1820. For nearly a decade, Britain had a king in title and a regent in practice, and the world adjusted accordingly. This is not an isolated precedent. The line between heir and king has blurred before, always during periods of royal vulnerability, always through the same mechanism, not a formal transfer, but a quiet, institutional recalibration around whoever is actually making decisions. What makes the current situation different is not the pattern. The pattern is centuries old. What makes it different is the absence of any formal structure around it. No Regency Act, no constitutional mechanism, no public acknowledgement. The power moved, nothing was put in writing. And that absence is what makes this moment historically distinct. Robert Hardman has spent decades inside the world he writes about. He is the author of multiple royal biographies, among them Queen of Our Times and Our Queen. He has documented the British monarchy across 3 reigns with a level of institutional access that most journalists spend entire careers attempting to acquire. He is respected by audiences who support the monarchy and by audiences who don't, because his analysis operates at the level of documented fact rather than partisan position. When Hardman speaks about royal succession and the heir's constitutional role, he speaks as someone who has sat in the rooms, read the documents, and understood the machinery from the inside. He also has a significant conflict of interest. His biographical work depends on continued palace cooperation. His professional standing rests, in part, on institutional goodwill. A man whose career depends on palace access does not lightly suggest that authority has shifted. When Hardman says something that the palace would prefer unsaid, he is saying it knowing exactly what it costs him to say it. In 2024, Hardman made public statements on Charles's position and William's expanding role. He cited Harvard professor Joe Nye's framework on soft power, identifying the monarchy as one of Britain's 2 top-class soft power assets alongside the English language. He noted that the real threat to the institution is not revolution but irrelevance, and that every generation must justify itself. On Charles specifically, Hardman's documented assessment was, quote, needed. Hardman, 2024, on William's expanding role and constitutional implications, or on Charles's current position. Verify exact wording from royaltopia.net and gbnews.com sources before recording. What the documented picture shows is a commentator with every professional reason to frame the current situation as stable and managed, who nonetheless describes a monarchy under active pressure to justify its existence, led by a king whose legacy is being shaped in real time by the son waiting behind him. That is not inflammatory commentary. From Robert Hardman, it is as close to an alarm as you are going to get. Here is what I actually think. William was right. The contact was a liability, the timing was dangerous, and the monarchy needed someone willing to make the hard call when Charles no longer had the energy to make it. On the merits, William's read was correct. That does not make what he did acceptable. You do not time a confrontation for your father's weakest moment and call it institutional duty. You do not engineer an outcome and present it as a conversation. The rightness of the destination does not clean up the method of getting there. Charles built something real when he chose Camilla. He proved once that the person could matter more than the position. What this story reveals is that the proof had an expiry date, and his son knew exactly when it ran out. The institution won. It always wins. The only question this story leaves open is whether Charles knew that when he married her, or whether he found out the same way Camilla did, quietly, without announcement, in a room where the walls had already moved. For 22 years, Charles waited to be king. He outlasted public contempt. He outlasted the grief of a nation that blamed him for the end of a fairy tale. He outlasted the advisors who told him the woman he loved would never be accepted, and he married her anyway. When the crown finally came, it came with cancer. And somewhere inside that, somewhere beneath the diagnosis and the treatment schedules and the carefully managed public statements, his son had already started making decisions. This is what the story looks like from the outside. An heir steps up during a health crisis. Temporary, supportive, entirely appropriate. That is not what this story is about. What it's actually about is a king who looked at the man his son had become. Strategic, cold when he needed to be cold, protective of the institution above everything else, and recognized something, not a threat, something harder to name than that. He recognized himself, the version of himself he'd always meant to be. William didn't move against Camilla because he hated her. He moved against everything that could weaken what Charles had spent a lifetime building. And Charles understood that, even when it cost him the one person who had stood by him when no one else would. He let it happen. Not because he was too sick to stop it, because somewhere beneath the crown, he knew his son was right. That's the story. Not a palace coup. A father watching his son protect something he loved more than he loved himself. Institutional power always outlasts personal loyalty. The moment you accept that truth, really accept it, not as an abstract principle, but as a decision you're prepared to act on, the people who relied on you start to disappear. Not dramatically, not with a confrontation or a formal announcement. They're just consulted less, invited to fewer rooms. Their calls get returned a little slower until one day they stop expecting a call at all. Camilla didn't lose her title. She didn't lose her public role. What she lost is harder to name and impossible to restore. The quiet certainty that the man she'd built her life around would choose her when it mattered. He had once. For 20 years, he chose her against everything. This time, the institution was louder than the marriage. And Charles, who knew better than anyone what it costs to love someone the crown doesn't approve of, made the same calculation his family had been making for 300 years. Duty that outlasts the man who wears it. That's what William was protecting. That's what Charles surrendered to. And that's what Camilla is left living inside. A glass house with her name on the door, and no say in who gets to enter. One question before you go. If you were Charles, would you have stood by Camilla and faced William down, or made the same choice he did? I want to know where you stand. Comment below.